Okay, all right, great. So let me move on to the next segment here. I mean, when I say next, I simply mean, that because we're speaking, remember that what we're really talking about is this whole period until, um, you know, following the Battle of Plassey until the Mutiny of 1857, which we will cover in the next lecture. But I do want to look at something I've talked about before, and you said you were very keen on hearing about this, definitely, and that's the social life of the British in India. So this is from the early 1600s, but we're going to only look at a few very small aspects of it. And I want to begin with a book, which is my source, to explain to you once again some of the problems that we have, because as you know by now, we are not simply looking at, well, what happened in a certain period of time, how does one explain a certain phenomenon, but when we look at the act of explanation of a phenomenon, and we have to see, well, who is doing that interpretation? What's driving that interpretation? And what are the grounds for that interpretation? And what might be some of the problems with that, right? So when I say social life of the British here, um, so let's say from the 1600s to the 1800s, we're talking about a 200, 250-year period, roughly. What we're talking about is, so what was their level of interaction with Indians, for example? Is such, for example, is something like friendship possible between Indians and the English? We don't really hear much about friendship between the Indians and the English. Um, how did the British amuse themselves? What did they do there? I mean, when they're not making money and when they're not fighting a war or serving as mercenaries, the East India Company soldiers are going to be serving as mercenaries, basically. That is, that they're paid to fight a war, right? And the company will lend out its troops, as we'll see later on, essentially as mercenary troops. So if an Indian ruler says, yeah, I need troops to defend my territory against another Indian ruler, the company will say, we'll defend your territory, you just pay us a sum of money. That's called a subsidy. Now, when troops do that, that's called being mercenaries, right? Because mercenaries are soldiers who are for hire, essentially. So when they're not for hire, when they're not fighting, when they're not making money or looting, uh, what are their amusements? How do they spend their time? Right? I always, I'm now, just so that I trigger your imagination about what I'm really talking about. So, if you drink, well, there's one drink that was invented in India, one of the most famous cocktails, and I'm talking about gin and tonic, right? Because tonic, as you know, tonic water has quinine, and this has anti-malarial properties, right? So, and malaria was a problem in India, as it still is in some places. So the gin and tonic was invented basically at British clubs in India. So when we look at social life, we're talking about this. But here, let me make that particular story more interesting, right? And this is where the unbelievable part of it comes, all right? So, to have a good gin and tonic, you also need to put ice. Right? Now, in 1850, where are you going to get ice? There's no refrigeration, right? So where do you get ice, right? How do you, where did they get their ice from? And I won't pose the question, because if I allowed you 5,000 guesses, if I hadn't told you this, you would not have been able to answer the question, because no one is, unless they know the literature I'm talking about. What was the largest item of export from the United States to India in, for example, 1850? The answer is ice. It sounds absurd to people, but that's the fact. It's called the frozen water trade. They would take these huge, you know, pieces of ice, which they would carve out of New England, where it freezes, and you put them on a tugboat, as it were, okay, or some kind of trawler. You put it on that, you wrap it up in sacks and everything. The larger the piece of ice, uh, the greater the portion of it that will survive until it gets to its destination, because it will melt along the way, some of it, and it melts from the sides. Right? But this was the largest item of export, believe it or not. All right. And they needed the ice for the gin and tonic in their clubs. So you read all these novels that are written by the English, some very famous ones, most famous perhaps with scenes set at the club, uh, being E.M. Forster's novel A Passage to India, 1924, or let's take another novel around that time by another very famous writer, except that this one is set in Burma, which was, of course, part of British India, right? Here I'm talking about a novel by um, um, George Orwell, right? Where again the scenes are set in the club, in the British club, right? So this is what I mean by social life. The clubs that they set up, the hill stations that they had, where the Indian middle class loves to go, uh, to these hill stations. I didn't mention, by the way, I just realized the name of the novel, Burmese Days, that Orwell wrote. So the hill stations, uh, the game of polo, which is played by very upper crust Indians even today. Um, right? All of these things, that's part of the social life of the British. So uh, William Dalrymple, who I've mentioned in other contexts, he has a book called White Mughals. And here I take a few passages from his book because it's a very interesting book, but it's very typical of the work that he's done, where he delves into material, including archival material that many have not delved into. Um, and can tell stories beautifully and elegantly. But he's not a very politically savvy writer, if I may say so. Right? He sort of makes all these arguments without really thinking through the implications of what he's saying. Right? So, for example, in this book, he says, and so these numbers in parentheses are page numbers. Um, uh, there were, in fact, a great many Europeans at this period, 1700s, even 1600s, especially the latter half of the 1600s, 1700s, who responded to India in a way that perhaps surprises and appeals to us today by crossing over from one culture to another and wholeheartedly embracing the great diversity of late Mughal India. End quote. Okay. Dalrymple, by the way, is, in case you don't know, he's an Englishman who lives outside Delhi in one of these big farmhouses. All right. Um, so, he's in a way the kind of Englishman who has crossed over. Uh, and he's writing about, in a way, people like his ancestors, if I may put it this way, 300 years ago, right? And saying that, well, there are Englishmen who went to India and they loved it, if I may put it colloquially, because what did they do? They crossed over from one culture that is theirs to another, right? Virtually all Englishmen in India at this period Indianized themselves to some extent. Virtually all Englishmen in India in 1600s, of course, we're not talking about that many Englishmen. We're not talking about thousands of Englishmen. We're talking about, you know, really dozens in the first 1620s. And then when we get into the 1630s, moving into the 1660s, 70s, 80s, okay, we're talking about a few hundred at most company employees. They would have been all company employees at this point in time. So we're not talking about a massive number of uh, people there, but nonetheless, all Englishmen Indianize themselves. So, what does Indianize mean? It means, for example, that many of them took to Indian dress. All right? They found Indian dress more comfortable. So, like modern day would be kurta pajama, for example. Back in those days, if you look at the Mughal emperors and the courtiers and how they dress, it looks very stiff compared to now, but it would be essentially somewhat looser uh, fitting clothes. than what the English were accustomed to. And in a hot and tropical climate, that would make sense. So whether that means Indianizing or whether it simply means that, well, they were using their common sense, one can question that. But it also meant that they were accustomed to, for example, what you might describe as Indian um, uh, amusements. So, for example, the amusements I'm talking about is this. Look, if you look at this print here, what do you see? You see an Englishman who's sitting there and at a table, and he's got an Indian servant. Uh, and I want to just, for the moment, just momentarily lay aside this servant question. And what is he doing? He's smoking a hookah. So the Indian prepares a hookah, his servant prepares a hookah for him, and he smokes a hookah, right? This would be an illustration of Indianizing. In this case, you have a number, you can see clearly that they are Europeans, right? If you look at these 5 men here, they're Europeans. And what are they doing? They're watching a nautch girl. She's called a nautch girl. And there's a long, interesting history of nautch girls. So basically, a dancer for hire. Um, they would have been, some of the people would have considered nautch girls to be prostitutes too, but that's a complicated question of nautch girls, uh, prostitutes, courtesans, because courtesans, for example, were women who didn't just provide sex uh, to male clients as a prostitute might, but were actually women who were learned in the arts. So, for example, there might be accomplished singers or accomplished dancers, and some of them might even write. The very famous courtesan, as it were, about whom a lot has been written, and a fantastic film was made called Umrao Jan, right? About 30, 35 years ago. So that's a courtesan. Nautch girls are dancing girls. The implication being that they're of, loose morals, they're not attached to a man, and they're probably available for sexual pleasure as well. So the question is whether all of this means you've Indianized, or it simply means that, well, you're there, you're in India, and you're habituated to consorting with Indians, particularly Indian women. Now, one thing I need to say about the British, particularly as we move on in time, when you get into the late 1700s, early 1800s, at that time, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the most Britishers in India, let's say 1800, just take a random date, around that time, most Britishers in India at that time had almost no interaction with Indians except under these circumstances. One, they knew Indians as servants, because any Englishmen staying in India, no matter how low they were, how low down the hierarchy they were still better off than many people. And any Englishman would have a household of servants. Okay, the ones who were better off had a lot more servants, and these duties were the duties were parceled out. Uh, so the bavarchi, the cook, that's one position. The ayah is the woman who takes care of your young ones, right? So the British Mem Sahib, the white woman, would leave her very young children to the care of the ayah. She's the one who would look after the young ones. Bigger households would have a whole coterie of servants, including what would be the equivalent of the butler, and people who worked in the kitchen, people whose responsibility was to clean the house. Then you have a guy who's a pankhewala. So his job is, because in those days when there was no electricity, say circa 1800, even some decades after that, obviously many decades after that, until electricity came in, you had these fans where the person actually is, moving this thing from the ceiling with a string, right? That's all he's doing. So he's circulating the air. Right? That's what his job is. And that was the kind of Indians that the British had interaction with. Number one, the servant class, and number two, especially the upper crust British, interacted with the Indian Rajas, with the rulers, Indian Maharajas. So because even out, because apart from British India, you had large parts of India which were not directly under British rule, and so the governor general, the governor, somebody's coming from England, very high a person, they would typically take them hunting. Hunting was a big occupation, and it was done with enormous relish. For example, you look at this photograph over here. Uh, this is May 1920, where Mummy and her tiger, this English woman, she's shot a tiger. You can see the rifle in her hand, and she's obviously sending this image to her children, either back in England or wherever they are, showing this kill that she's made, right? This is a typical scene of hunting. There would be a hunting party. The British would go with these elephants, and of course there would be and they would sit on the howdah, on top of the elephant, and there would be the mahout, the elephant driver, right? And here you can see the elephant over here, and uh, you know, uh, uh, hunting for tigers or other wild animals. The depletion of wild animals at that time was enormous, enormous. I mean, there are photographs where you see hundreds of skins laid out. It's like trophy hunting, this kind of shot, because this also, you see, you have to interpret it. Scene like this one here, you have to really interpret this, because this is, not simply saying, oh, look, this is my catch. Okay, here's this elephant, tiger, I've just shot it dead. You see, it's like flaunting his masculinity. You look at the poise with which he's standing, all right, with his solar topi. And in a way, it's like the tigers, they're all his possessions, right? That's the way in which it is framed very often. So, this is another hunting scene, obviously, here. Again, tiger hunting. Um, and this was a sort of thing that was really happening. This is much later that I'm really talking about. I want to just go back to the early period, because what I'm suggesting here is that if you take Dalrymple's words, then we have to ask some serious question. What does he really mean by all of this? All right. And before I give you some other illustrations of that, he says, India has had a strange way with her conquerors. In defeat, she beckons them in, then slowly seduces, assimilates, and transforms them, right? Without realizing it, by the way, he has done what every Britisher ever did, which is he has feminized India itself. India is like this woman, that men think they can achieve a sexual conquest over women. They can dominate them, but women are clever. They're cunning. They know how to tame their men, how to domesticate them. India itself, what he's done is he's actually feminized India. In defeat, it's like a woman who's been sexually conquered, but then she uses her cunning, her wile, her femininity to seduce the man, domesticate him, tame him, right? There is another theory here, which is what I call the sponge theory, right? And India is like this massive sponge. So it's like a milk spill. You spill a glass of milk. What do? You rush to get something that's will absorb it, a sponge, or let's say thick paper towel, right? Something that will absorb the milk. India is like a sponge. Foreigners come there, they think they've conquered the country, they get absorbed. Right? So vast is India, and so uniquely resilient and deeply rooted are her intertwined social and religious institutions, that all foreign intruders are sooner or later either shaken off or absorbed. Well, what is sooner or later? I mean, if it's 300 years, well, I would say that's pretty late. So what I'm saying is that, he thinks he's giving a very fancy account where he wants to suggest that, well, the British in India, when they first came, and when for the first 150 years, they were not that really nasty lot that, we think that the English are. Because if you look at them later on, you say, oh, conquerors, you know, colonizers, destroyed Indian culture. He's saying, no, the first 150 years, the English came, actually India conquered them, won them over, because that's how India is, right? It's vast, it's resilient, its institutions are very deep, right? This is what he's saying. So what sounds like a compliment, I'm just saying we'd have to complicate it. And this is what I mean, that he's not actually politically very savvy at all right? Because then we also have to ask, so well, what happened? And you might say, well, what do you mean, what happened? So for example, about 1800, 1810, you read the letters that the English write back to their family members in India, horribly racist, horribly racist. Why? Well, they'll say, the Indians, they're darky. They use, the word nigger all the time to describe Indians. These darkies, the N word is constantly being used, right? And they're savages, they're this and that. So what happened? If what Dalrymple is saying, because he's certainly right, that you have people like this man called Hindu Stewart. Why is he called Hindu Stewart? He's an Englishman whose name is Charles Stewart, lives from 1758 to 1828. He rises to the rank of Major General and dies in India. I mean, he lived in India so he would have come to India, I forget the exact year, but let's say around when he was about 20 years old. So that's 1778. He lived in India for 50 years. And he never left India. He's actually comes from Ireland. He comes from Ireland. He's an Irishman, works for the company. They're all company employees. And he rises through the ranks of the company. Why is he called Hindu Stewart? Because, for example, he took a bath daily in the Ganga, right? Or the Ganges, river that is holy to the Hindus. He defends Hinduism. He takes to Indian dress, which I've spoken about, taking to Indian dress, but he's also defends Hinduism. Now, this is worthwhile spending a minute or two. He writes a book in 1808 called Vindication of the Hindus. The reason he's writing this book, 1808, is because by this time the English, remember now, this is 50 years after Plassey. Now the company is well established, and basically there are attacks on Hinduism. This is why I brought in the evangelicals, that they're saying, hey, this is a heathen country. We need to bring in Christianity. That's a religion of much higher morals. Hinduism is a degraded religion, a bizarre religion with millions of gods and goddesses. Some of them look, horrendous, and Kali is frightening. Right? And what are their morals, these people, right? I mean, look at the figure of Krishna, a Hindu god who's got, making love to thousands of women. What kind of religion is this? It's a religion of absurdity. That's the evangelical view. He defends. Charles Stewart writes books. He says, whenever I look around me in the vast ocean of Hindu mythology, I discover piety, morality. He's saying all of these tales are morality tales in some ways. And as far as I can rely on my judgment, it appears a most complete and ample system of moral allegory that the world has ever produced. Allegory, when it's an allegorical text, it means that this is a text which is conveying through this story, right, a certain kind of parable about human conduct. Right? So he's saying this is not the religion that my countrymen are describing as. It's a very different religion. It's actually a morally very superior kind of religion. And by the way, even the title of Dalrymple's book, which is published in 2002, the book is called White Mughals, right? Because essentially what he's saying is these white men who came to India in the 1600s and then in the 1700s as well, they basically get absorbed into the society that exists at that time, which had been shaped at that point, right, by the Mughals, because they had been the dominant power for 300 years, 300 years in India, right? What he's saying here, The title of the book itself, White Mughals, actually there's a British writer by the name of Archie Barron who had used that phrase White Mughals in a book he wrote the year before, that was published a year before, An Indian Affair, Archie Barron, all right, where he makes a very interesting point. I want to just quote that it was far years easier to break into Muslim society than the exclusive and mysterious world of Brahmanical Hinduism, which makes Hindu Stewart a rarity even among the white Mughals. Right? What he's saying is that Hindu Stewart was actually unusual uh, among the Englishmen in that he found Hinduism rather than Islam more congenial and attractive. Islam was a religion that the English had an easier time understanding. It's, you've got one holy book. Okay, these are the teachings of that holy book. The problem with the Hindus is they have thousands of holy books. One person reads the Vedas or has memorized the Vedas. The other person refers to the Upanishads, the third to the Brahma Sutra, the fourth to the Bhagavad Gita, the fifth to the Ramayana, so on and so forth. They have so many places of pilgrimage. It's a massive religion that accommodates a large variety of views under its rubric, much more opaque and dense to the European mind. So he's saying that most of the Englishmen, to the extent that they assimilated, they actually really, it was the world of Islamic India, not Hindu India, that they assimilated to, right? Now, if you look at Hindu Stewart, I said, so what is it that he gets to be called Hindu Stewart because he was viewed as being essentially a Hindu, right? He takes to Indian dress, he defends Hinduism, he bathes daily in the Ganga and so on. But here is a critical set of questions I want to just ask. And this is the first phase I'm talking about. So 1600s to, um, let's say, about the late 1700s, right? So what happened? In other words, if these Englishmen in India were really, hey, they Indianized themselves, as Dalrymple says. They got seduced by India. India is this fantastic country that has a way of absorbing the conqueror. But something happened, right? Because then 200 years, 100 years later, let's say around 1800, we find the Englishmen abusing the country, using the nastiest language, talking about Indians in the most openly racist way that you can think about. Right? Something happened, right? And why is it that they found India, before we even can answer that question? What really was happening in India? That is, is it the case that they found India just to be more open and more cosmopolitan society, that maybe they were not judged by the same standards of conduct that they were judged by back in England itself? That perhaps Indians took, let's say, a more relaxed view of sexuality, that it was not completely puritanical. That doesn't mean that it was a society of uh, loose morals, if I may use that phrase. And I'm not saying that, I'm not making any proposition one way or the other. I'm saying that, does somebody like Dalrymple have an explanation why the English found India to be more open? And did they find it to be a more open society? All right. Now, the other question is, what about English women? And the answer there is very simple, and that gives the whole game away. If you think about it, you see, in the 1600s and the 1700s, until the late 1700s, when Englishmen start coming. Before that, in the 1600s and the last part of 1700s, there are very few English women in India, very few. Because until British rule really became established, the people who came to work for the company were men. As in England itself, women did not work outside except after the Industrial Revolution, when some number of women start to work outside the home, outside the farm as well. But English women, did not occupy positions in civil society. They're not shopkeepers, for example, or things of that kind, right? Grocers, butchers, they don't work in those professions at all, right? And similarly, the company had no women employees. They're all men. So there were no English women coming at all. So therefore, everything he's saying is saying, what he's saying is really only true for English men. And this is what gives the game away, because at some point this paradise, which is how it's almost described as, that India was really kind of a paradise for the Englishman. He goes there, he takes to Indian clothes, uh, everything is hunky-dory. Things, social relations are good between him and Indians. Not that he's really able to really describe too many of what you would call friendships, but there are some social relations. There are some people who get along. He gives a few cases of that, right? It's a kind of what I'm calling a paradise. At some point, this paradise ended. When did it end? When English women start coming to India. Because now, when English women start coming to India, then of course their own menfolk cannot go out and sleep around with Indian women, go to these nautch dances, because that's clearly sinful, right? Watching a woman, in provocative clothing, just that would be like going to a striptease or something today, right? So these women are not going to tolerate that, obviously. So you see what's happening. If you do a political analysis, it's now once again, it's the women who are responsible for having screwed up everything. Right? Everything was kind of moving along in India, Well, yes, there was this conquest, but at least social relations, things were kind of hunky-dory. The Englishmen loved to smoke the hookah. They watch these nautch dances. They mix around with Indians. There's no social barrier. There's no racial barrier. They've Indianized themselves. And then these women come and they completely change everything. And this is, of course, where the problem is with the analysis. Because if you were doing a feminist analysis, you'd say, we've seen it now, right? That in the last analysis, it's always the women who are responsible for breaking up the paradise, right? If I had to put it in a more theoretical way, and then I'll quickly go to the second phase of it, and then we pause and you bring up all the questions that come to mind. In a more theoretical way, I think we need to distinguish between bicultural, intercultural, multicultural. Okay? I put intercultural twice there. Bicultural, intercultural, and multicultural worlds. So you see, bicultural is where someone actually belongs to two cultures, or believes himself or herself to belong to two cultures. Right? So let's say you're an Indian and you're growing up in the United States, and you are very much at ease in American society, and mainstream white American society, let's say. And you're also very much at ease in Indian society. You can switch registers. And when you're white Americans, you're fluent in that world, you're fluent in English, you understand the culture, you know how to eat spaghetti, you know how to use a fork and knife. When you're with Indians, you know how to eat Indian food, you love Indian food, you can speak the Indian language. But it's not simply that, right? That bicultural, really, truly bicultural means where you say that I'm actually part of two worldviews, because culture cannot simply be reduced to these things. These are all important, but the categories through which I think, that English gives me one set of categories, Hindi or Tamil or Bangla gives me another set of categories, and I can use both of them. I can move back and forth between these two cultures. That's being bicultural. Now, were these English bicultural? He doesn't ask that question, because one thing that's very interesting is that many of these people that he talks about, in a way, they kind of lost it in their own community. That is, that many of them become ostracized from their own community. They cease to be Englishmen. right? And some of them, by the way, formally converted. Some of them formally converted. And so, for example, he refers to a case where, as I said before, the numbers in parentheses are the pagination here that I'm really talking about. Yeah, he refers to actually these cases of these people, and so here he's referring to the case. This is a letter written by an Englishman in a high position in India, and he writes a letter back to company officials in 1649 about a 23-year-old young man. His name is Joshua Blackwell. And he says, if you look at this guy, he says he's an apostate. You know, apostate is someone who has renounced the faith. So, for example, in Islam, if you become an apostate to the faith, you can be in some countries, in some Muslim countries, that's considered a capital offense. You can be given a death sentence, literally, for abandoning the faith. All right. So he uses the word apostate. He writes to the company and says, there's this young fellow, he's my colleague in the company, and he's become an apostate because he's converted. All right, to Hinduism. All right. So I'm saying that actually we'd have to ask whether these people who became Indian, whether they actually became Indian and therefore lost their Englishness also, right? Because then they're not really bicultural. Intercultural is where you might, a person may be moving back and forth so seamlessly that you don't even make a distinction between distinct cultures and say, I'm actually bicultural. I'm, you know, this, I can be Indian when I want to be, I can be American when I want to be. And of course, if it's intercultural, we could be talking about two, three, four. You know, you've got mixed marriages now. I've got people I know, um, they've married someone else. And if you look at both their mother's and father's side, for both the male and the female, you're talking about four different ethnic groups that are involved here. All right. So that person may, in some ways, not simply by virtue of the fact that four different ethnic groups are involved here, but maybe moving seamlessly. All right. And between one culture and another, and more importantly, maybe using one culture to interrogate another culture, and maybe using that culture to interrogate yet another culture, right? That's interculturality. And then there's multicultural, which is actually a very modern category. It's really an American, so when you were living here, you would have heard the word multicultural, for example, being used all the time. When, for example, the school district in a certain city says, well, we'll have a celebration of Diwali too. We have a celebration for Passover or Hanukkah. We have a celebration when Eid takes place. For the Muslims, we have a celebration, for Christians at Easter or Christmas. We'll have a celebration for the Hindus as well when there's Diwali. That's multiculturalism. It's a policy dictated from the top. Okay, and I'm very critical actually of this whole argument about multiculturalism, but that's not central to what I want to say here. I'm saying that the problem with this argument, apart from the fact that he's simply, in a way, essentially found what he thinks is the real target of attack, namely that it's women who spoil this paradise. Apart from that, I don't think he actually, and when I say he here now, I'm really talking about all of these people who may be making similar arguments, but who frankly don't really understand, in my view, how we should be looking at the English in India at this time. This is, by the way, the tombstone of Charles Stewart, i.e., Hindu Stewart, at South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta today, right? Because as I said, he essentially lives there for 50 years of his life and dies there. I mean, he would have been unknown in England at that point in time. And here is a very famous painting reproduced in almost every book dealing with this period of an Englishman. You can see, like, he looks like a Mughal prince. He's dressed like a Mughal prince. Except that he's the British resident to the Mughal court, right? So he's because at that point in time, the English had really conquered Delhi in a way. So the Mughal emperor is now being confined. We'll talk about this later on. Particularly when we get to the mutiny, because we'll be talking about the Mughal emperors once again. He is a resident, the British official who is basically representing the governor general at the court of the Mughal emperor. And we don't know for sure whether it's him, but this is the most likely guess. But it's an Englishman, and he's smoking the hookah. He's sitting there, as you can see, with cushions against his back on a carpet, just like an Indian prince would. And it's a completely Indianized scene. Here you have the women in the front, who there's the woman here who's the performer here, you can see, right? She's on her feet. You can see the postures, the hand movements, and you have courtiers and servants, accompanying musicians here, over here, right? So this is a man who's watching a nautch dance at his home in Delhi. This painting is in the British Library. That's the first phase. Now, in the second phase, when we talk about the social life of the British, that is when things have now started to get settled down. So we're starting to move into the 1800s. I'm going to really be brief here because all of these things could take a lot of time, but it's really so you understand the larger picture that we're talking about here, right? And that is that, you see, when they start to settle down, they will try to recreate portions of England in India. That's the first thing to keep in mind. They will try to recreate. This is not unusual. I mean, I'm using a very modern day colloquialism, where I don't actually like phrases like that, but I'm using it for the sake of convenience, that they're trying to increase their comfort zone. You're in a place where you're not really interacting with Indians, because who are the Indians you interact with? I've pointed that out: servants. And that you're doing simply from necessity. You give commands, you give orders, and you expect these orders to be obeyed. But you don't spend your social life with your servants. You don't sit around with them and play cards and drink gin and tonic with them. Right? And then the other Indians are the Maharajas. But that is really more for the British upper crust. Okay, so your average Englishman in India is not mixing around with the Maharaja. And then, of course, there were some who were actually merchants and trading with Indians. So they were business contacts to some degree. But for example, for English women, no contact with Indians except with servants, And you see, very few people have taken into consideration the consequences of that. Because in effect, you were really only meeting with Indians of a certain class, right? I mean, if you're servants, well, you're not educated. You're not educated. Your language is rough to the extent that there's any communication, between other than the command that is uttered. All right, and in fact, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this also actually is about the conquest of knowledge here. So there's this Englishman. He writes. His name is John Gilchrist, and he writes a grammar of Hindustani. The purpose of the grammar is to explain to the British who come to India and who want to learn the language. How do you learn Hindustani? So that's what a grammar does, right? But it's more like, if I may put it this way, a phrase book. So he gives this illustration. He says, let's take a sentence, and that sentence might be something like, say you are an English mem sahib, you're a white English woman, you're living in this bungalow in the Indian countryside, and you've got 10 servants, and you're hosting a party for the British friends you have in that area, right? And the servant has been instructed, put a table setting for 8 people, and that's what it's done. But when the British guests come, they have brought unannounced 1 extra guest, so now we need a 9th place setting. So Gilchrist says, take the sentence, please fetch a plate. All right, you shout that command out to your servant. Then he says, and then he gives you the translation of that. Please fetch a plate. Kripa ek plate laiye. Kripa, please ek plate laiye. Please bring a plate. Then he says, No need to speak to your servants with such degree of politeness and such a lengthy sentence. This is a lengthy sentence from his point of view. Why waste your words? Okay, so he says, take out the word please. Just say, fetch a plate in a certain tone, right? And then he gives you the translation, plate lao, not plate laiye, which would be the polite form. Kripa ek plate laiye. Lao, plate lao is just bring a plate, damn it. And then he says, why waste words with a servant? There's no need to actually say a full sentence. He cuts it out. Then and this is all printed in the phrase book. Then he gives you the third. He says, all you need to do is shout out the word plate loudly enough. Because if you tell plate loudly enough to the servant, unless this servant is absolutely dumb, he knows he's supposed to bring a plate, not break a plate. Right? I mean, it's absurd. But that's you see what he's also showing, although he doesn't realize it, is in a way is that this is actually not just the servant. This is the whole class of people, and that's what your interaction is limited to, right? So if we're going to do this social history of the British in India and look at their social life, I mean, we can complicate it a lot more. But whole idea also that I'm talking about is that they were trying to create within India the semblance of something like England. Many of them knowing that they might never go back, or if they go back, it might be decades before they go back, right? And the idea was, well, our children will never really know England at all. So what they try to do is they try to create, the circumstances, recreate the, let me rephrase the sentence, sorry. They try to create in India the social conditions that facilitate certain kind of institutions, such as, for example, the club, where in the club Indians were not permitted. And if you read these two novels I mentioned to you, Passage to India and Burmese Days, John Masters is another novelist who wrote novels about the English in India, well-known novels, but these two I think I would say are the most well-known novels, particularly those which have scenes from clubs and so on. These were basically racially exclusive zones and areas, just like private clubs in the United States. Like Washington, D.C., until quite recently, still had one club that did not admit African Americans until about, I think, 15, 20 years ago. Because, the whole argument is these are private institutions, they can set their rules. And of course, a large number of clubs have never admitted women, including university clubs at the elite universities for decades. Right? So there can be various grounds for excluding people, and race and sex have undoubtedly been two of the major ones. Religion sometimes can factor in. But the club was one because this was a place where the English would gather, and they would play cards, chat, the men would relax, there would be a cigar room, which the men would go to after dinner, right? All of that. Then you had these boarding schools, which a lot of elite Indians even today, really the upper crust Indians, even today, they sometimes are graduates of these boarding schools. And these were what you might call the nurseries of the ruling race. That is, this is where you send your children. The idea was that they would grow up with other Englishmen. And at that point, the boarding schools were all segregated by sex, for boys and girls separate. Critically important, of course, were the ones for boys, on the supposition that this is where they would, in a sense, and that's what I mean by nurseries of the ruling race, get trained to, govern the country where they were living, because the assumption was, and you have English families which had, by the 1900s, there were families in India, English families that had been living in India for 100 years, for 3 generations. Not unknown by any stretch of the imagination, and these would be strictly British enclaves and modeled very often after boarding schools back in England itself, right? So because some of the wealthiest sent their kids back to England, and then they came back to India, but there were boarding schools in India And some of them, this is where the histories get far too complicated for us to get into, because some of them would admit the sons of native rulers, the Maharajas. So Mayo College, for example, admitted Indians as well after a certain point in time, and that's where you would have a mix in some of these schools, but in some of these boarding schools, but relatively few. Of course, as things changed, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, as some of that scenario began to change. And then, of course, you had these sports, cricket. If you've seen the film Lagan, I think you would know exactly what I mean, because there, in a sense, the culture of cricket and its relationship to the club as well, all of that is, I think, explored in this film really as well. And then you had hunting, pig sticking, polo, all of that. The main, okay, two things to look at here is that there is unquestionably evidence, and I've now talked about that, unquestionably evidence of the deterioration of racial relations with Indians. And partly, as I pointed out, that is because the British, for a long time, many of the British had no contact with Indians except with the lowest class of people in India. And here when I say lowest class here, I don't mean that, I view them necessarily as, lowest class, and that they're without class, so to speak, but simply acknowledging the brute fact that these were people who worked as servants. And when I use the word servants, I'm using it in the broadest sense to indicate people who may have been cooks, bawarchis, might have been ayahs, might have been gardeners, malis, right? They could have had any number of jobs at the household of an Englishman and an Englishwoman. And I can tell you that some of the really well off English, including the top layer of the ruling elite, often had 30, 40, 50, okay, servants in the household. One person's job would be to simply wash the clothes, the dhobi, and others would be to actually iron the clothes. Several people working in the kitchen with a head bawarchi. You can see how Malis, because these bungalows had large grounds, and so you would have a number of Malis as well, right? And so on, right? In some ways, I'm also suggesting that the British actually out Brahmined the Brahmins. They, in a sense, came to love the caste system, where they thought of themselves as actually even superior to the Brahmins. And that's what I mean by out Brahmined the Brahmins. And remember that England itself was a hideously class bound society, very, very class bound, as in some respects it has been. The aristocratic elite and where they come from and how they look down upon people, working in factories, people with, we used to hear about this, and there's actually a lot of linguistic work done on, the Cockney accent as opposed to the Oxbridge accent. Right? All of that, you can summon large amounts of evidence from different domains of life. Very few instances of intermarriage, right? Between, that is, they were children, obviously, but that was because of illicit sexual relations. And we'll have to leave that aside for the moment completely, the whole question of Anglo-Indians, right? But two main points after I've said all of that. One is the one I've mentioned, deterioration of racial relations with Indians, particularly beginning, I would say, around 1800 or so, right? And secondly, as in some ways the perfect illustration of what I'm describing as the transformation of the Indian landscape, so that India begins to look, or portions of India begins to look like England. It's the best illustration of that would be the creation of these hill stations. And a lot could be said about them. The first thing, of course, in brief, apart from the general argument that these are places where the British recreated, okay, as much of Little England as they could, as much of England as they could, and created a Little England. So, green spaces, obviously the altitude is higher. So you're talking about, less heat, escape from the heat of the plains. This difference between the plains and the hills is enormous in English literature of that time on India, right? And again, a very, very large subject for discussion. But the plains represented, you know, the heart of India, um, but the heart that was suffering under intense heat for 6 months of the year. All right. The hills offered a relief from that. The English were prone to diseases a lot. India was tough for them. It was tough on their stomach. So, you know, uh, the hills were places of refuge in all of these respects. You get more greenery, and particularly in the hill stations, they would replicate all the English customs. So you have tea, you have, scones with clotted cream. And they had this tradition of calling upon each other. There's a beautiful little book which collects these memories from the later period where Englishmen who had been in India, who had lived in India, done by Charles Allen. The book is called Plain Tales from the Raj, where he talked to a lot of these people who had lived in India and what their life was like. And they described the customs, how they'd go from one custom when a new person came. Um, a new Englishman who had been posted to a place, he would take his calling card, he would leave it at every home, and how the women would serve him tea and these sandwiches and the culture of cricket and all of that, right? All these recollections of it, right? The hill stations, of course, I mean, I've written a long article on hill stations many, many years ago where I talk about, they're a place which offered refuge from illness, from consumption, from TB, from the heat, from the plains, because the plains were also seen as places where, you couldn't escape India in a way. Now in the hills, there are fewer people there, for one thing, fewer people, less populated. Um, and one of the things that the British did, I mean, is, they actually later on uh, took one hill station called Shimla and they made it into their capital, their summer capital. So when for 6 months the whole British administration would move from Delhi to Shimla, they would take their files on, donkeys, okay, then of course there was a railway line. Eventually, didn't go all the way, but part of the way. But they would take, massive amounts of luggage and office files, and essentially the whole government would move there, all right, to Shimla. So that was and then once the summer started to phase out, the winter started to come in, then you move back to Delhi, back to the plains. This is after Delhi had become the capital after 1921, right? So the hill stations, and it's like the stations of the cross. If you go to a church, right? The stations of the of the cross that because it's called a hill station, so it's like you're going through these rites of life, as it were. Um, but there's a whole culture of these hill stations, and here are some. This map, which is produced by a company only in recent years, Maps of India, they have pinpointed many of the hill stations that were developed. And initially, remember that some of the hill stations, by the way, were not open to Indians, except of course to servants because they needed the servants. But you couldn't otherwise go if you were an Indian. They were British enclaves, and when Indians were permitted, Shimla, this is Shimla right here. You see that over here. They were not permitted, for example, on Mall Road. And you won't believe it, but I've seen actually the papers in the archive that when Gandhi was brought to Shimla for negotiating the independence of India, some British objected that he's being allowed to drive down Mall Road and that Indians are not permitted. And of course, some of the British said, well, that's a little kind of absurd, isn't it? We've called him here because he's negotiating for Indian independence, and now some of our fellow Britishers are telling us that an Indian can't even actually go down this road on a motor car because it's not permitted. A motor car carrying Indians is not permitted on Mall Road in Shimla. There's a whole file on this question, which I have seen in the British Library. All right. So these are the hill stations over here. And then this is modern day Shimla, just some years ago. And, here are a few of the photographs because very often, of course, particularly when you're climbing up the hills and everything, these British women would be taken on a palanquin, right? Which is what you're seeing over here. And this would be a typical sort of tea party. The servants also, by the way, I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware, I've shown you these slides before and we'll stop here. But servants, let me add one last thing, which is that Queen Victoria, as you may know, her favorite servant, he was called the Munshi. He was brought over from India. And he served her for 14 years. Okay, Mohammad Abdul Karim. And in 2017, Stephen Frears, one of the most interesting British directors, made a film called My Beautiful Laundrette, which is fabulous. 30 years ago, he made a film called, I think it's called Victoria and Abdul, which I saw, which is on the relationship between, and here when I say relationship, I don't mean obviously a sexual relationship. Some people have thought there might have been. I think that's rubbish, frankly. But the fact that he was the servant who was her personal favorite servant, and she spent a lot of time with him, and a lot of Britishers, especially high-ranking British officials back in London, were quite upset at the close proximity of Abdul to Victoria. So on that note, let me end this part of it.